First John is rich. It's rich in content. There's a lot there, but really the key theme I tried to focus our attention on for the course of these summer months is the idea of walking like Jesus. The term walk is used repeatedly in First John, the idea that our growth in faith, our maturity in Him has purpose. We're going somewhere. We're walking with Him, and we are walking like Him. One of the things that really stood out to me in preparing each Sunday and reading through 1 John and spending time in 1 John is the idea that we are called to action. We are not just a religious philosophy club that gathers on a Sunday morning to exchange ideas. That's not who we are. That is not who we are called to be. The passage that continues to stand out to me, and I think will for months to come, is from 1 John chapter 2, 5, and 6. I'd like just to review that real quickly this morning. In verse 5 of chapter 2, he says, "But if anyone obeys his words, God's love is truly made complete in him." And then verse 6 is especially convicting. "This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did." That's verse 6. Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did. To walk in purpose, to emulate the very character of Jesus is what we are called to. What does that look like for you? What are areas in your life that you know you could have a more Christ-like spirit? I want to give you just a quick preview before we get into our final lesson in 1 John. On the 20th of August, 2 weeks from today, in conjunction with the beginning of school, I'm going to begin a series on the Gospel of Luke, looking at the message of Luke's Gospel. I'm going to do something a little similar that we did in John's Gospel, that I'm going to spend 6 months in the Gospel of Luke. We'll begin on August the 20th, and Lord willing, finish on February the 25th, 2024. And then subsequently, following up Luke with part 2 of Luke's information, with being the book of Acts for the next 6 months. So Luke Acts, the way it should be appropriately studied. I think you'll be really appreciative of how the gospel is presented according to Luke. Dr. Luke, actually, Luke being a physician. So here's a challenge I have for you. To read with me, read along, and come up with your own reading schedule. So Luke has 24 chapters. If you were to read approximately a chapter a day, you could spend the month, finish up in 1 month. In other words, during the course of the 6 months, you could have actually read through Luke 6 times. Now, if you were really ambitious, you could read 2 chapters a day and end up reading Luke's gospel 12 times during the course of that 6-month period. Wouldn't that be rich? Wouldn't that be a great opportunity to really know Jesus better? If we're going to walk like him, we need to know him and not simply make assumptions about the very character of Jesus, but let's read the Gospels. How do the actions of Jesus stand out? The interactions that he has with people. Luke is rich with parables, lots of storytelling, more parables in the Gospel of Luke than any of the other Gospels. There are several stories that are unique to Luke's Gospel. For example, the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, the parable of the lost son in Luke chapter 15, the raising of the widow at Nain's only son in Luke chapter 7. Lots of things that are unique to Luke's Gospel where you feel like you actually know these people that are being described. It's just going to be a wonderful experience, and I just have to say I'm really excited. But back to 1 John. And this is going to be a little different version than what I read for you a moment ago, so it'll add to our experience of reading 1 John chapter 2, 15 through 17 together. So in our first reading during Call to Worship this morning, I encourage you just to choose a word or a phrase that really stood out to you. Let's read through this text a second time. This time, how does this passage speak to you personally? Is there one particular message that stands out? Is there something that's said that especially speaks to your heart? So a second reading of 1 John 2, 15 through 17, where he says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. if anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. The language choice in this particular version is just slightly different. The word lust is employed. Now, we generally think of lust with very negative connotations, but actually in the original language, the term lust simply means a very strong and overwhelming desire of any kind. So lust can be a good thing. If you have a strong desire to love God and to love His people, that strong desire obviously is good and holy. But of course, it's used in the negative connotation here, the lust of the flesh being the sinful nature. So the idea of loving the world, the part of the world that is under Satan's control and domain, the lust of the flesh, the sinful nature, the fleshly aspect being completely opposite of what is controlled by the Spirit. Do not love the world or anything in the world. So what really stands out to you, what speaks to you personally this morning? I want to do something a little different with this passage. You know, this is going to come as a great shock to all of you. I'm so glad you're sitting down. Preachers can be predictable. Did y'all know that? Did you know preachers can be really predictable? So I tell you, preachers are predictable when they preach from this particular passage because it has the appearance on the surface of having a built-in sermon. The built-in sermon is there's three really easy points: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. That's, if a preacher is going to preach from this text, well, there's my 3 points. It's built in. It's great. So I thought, you know, that's a valid sermon, and obviously those are valid points because they come straight from the text. But I don't want to be so predictable. I want to do something a little bit different so you don't go to lunch today and say, well, he was predictable, just like all preachers are predictable. So therefore, let's do something a little different this morning. I want to look at what I consider a parallel passage taken from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7. And I'm focused exclusively on verses 13 and 14. So here's what Jesus says. Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction. So let's pause there for a moment. The world and its desires pass away, but the man who loves the will of God lives forever. So the same thought, the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So as you look back on the two readings thus far of the text in 1 John chapter 2, again, I would pose the question, what really stands out to you, that word or phrase, and what personally especially speaks to you? And how does that shape how you seek the narrow road, if you will, in your life? I know this is a generational thing, so at least one, perhaps 2 generations before me is the dry goods store. So does anybody want to admit that you grew up with a dry goods store and the community that you grew up in? Does anybody want to admit that? You don't have to admit that if you don't want to. The dry goods store was sort of the store that had everything. And it was really the basic fundamentals of life. Jan actually had a great aunt and uncle that owned a dry goods store in Earth, Texas. Does everybody know where Earth is? You know, it's just a little suburb of Spring Lake. But they ran a dry goods store in Spring Lake, Earth, for a long, long time. And so people went and they got their necessities. That's when we were living in a more rural agrarian society, or far more farmers than there are today. It wasn't as much of an urban culture that we live in today. But now we're in the 21st century. And I would venture to say that our students probably have never heard of a dry goods store unless they read it in a history book. And so now we have the 21st century consumer mindset that that we have all this opportunity that goes well beyond the scope of a dry goods store. And we can go on Amazon and order all kinds of things. And we can go to even a box store somewhere, and there's so many options and so many opportunities. And yet that whole mindset, I've got all these opportunities and I've got so many options before me, that has this uncanny way of spilling into our understanding of what it means to be Christian. So as we think about not loving the world or anything in the world, this whole system. So you can say, I've got lots of choices as a Christian, which is true, is it not? Don't we have lots of choices? But those choices can be positive and they can also be negative. So unfortunately, it's common to view church as sort of like the flavor of the week at Brahms. I have choices and I want to go, well, what really suits my desire at this very moment? Sort of like the flavor of the week at Brahms. And even important moral choices that have consequences become a matter of consumer choice. So go back to John's fundamental exhortation. Do not love the world or anything in the world. So is it consumer choice or is it what God expects of me? And I certainly want to be social. I want to fit in. I want to do what everybody else is doing. So think about the three things listed there in 1 John chapter 2. So in Matthew chapter 7, and I made reference to the verse that we just read in verse 13, the whole idea of this narrow road is a part of the Sermon on the Mount. And repeatedly in the Sermon on the Mount, through Matthew chapter 5 through Matthew chapter 7, Jesus repeatedly points out two things. So two things, the necessity of choosing whether to follow God or not. Two things. Am I going to follow God or am I not going to follow God? The fact that the choices are two, and there are two gates, as we just noted, the narrow and wide. There are two ways, the narrow and broad. There are two destinations, life and destruction. And I would point out there's the parallel with the passage in 1 John chapter 2. Are we going to choose life? He who does the will of God lives forever, but the world and its desires pass away. Two groups, the few and the many. So there's such a broad way, and it entails so many people. Or I'm going to be that select few. I'm going to choose that narrow way. I'm going to choose God's way. I'm going to choose not to be a consumer. Two kinds of trees, which are mentioned a little bit later in the Sermon on the Mount, the good and the bad. Do we have good fruit in our lives? Or is our life bearing good fruit, or is it not? Two kinds of fruit, the good and the bad. Two kinds of people, the sincere and the false. That's also developed in the Sermon on the Mount. Two kinds of builders. There is a parable in Matthew's gospel in this part of the Sermon on the Mount, the idea of the wise and foolish builders. The foolish builders built their house on sand, and when a storm came along, it blew the house down, and the effective builders built a solid rock on the very words of Jesus. Two foundations, the rock and the sand. Two houses, secure and insecure. When the storm came, one house was secured and the other house was obviously insecure. I think it's a difficult concept for us to map our minds around because we're so accustomed in literally every facet of life to having multiple choices. Isn't it true? Again, I go back to Amazon, living in the consumer culture that we live in. You go and you're going to search anything. It doesn't make any difference what it is. Any sort of retail thing that you're going to purchase. And there are multiple choices in multiple colors and multiple shapes and forms and all kinds of bells and whistles because there are multiple choices. So it's a difficult concept for us to wrap our minds around. I'm going to choose this very, very narrow way because I'm so accustomed to such a broad scope of choices in every other area of my life. So to think in the terms especially of two choices, our immediate reaction may be, sounds a little narrow-minded, if not confining at that. And yet that is what we are called to. So why is the new way of life, the way to the kingdom of heaven, depicted as being narrow and maybe even rough? Rough might be an appropriate term. And here's just a few responses. It takes us to some places where we're going to have to make some painful and difficult choices. Back to 1 John 2, 15 through 17. Do not love the world or anything in the world. So that means we're going to have to make some choices. Am I driven by my own selfish desires of the flesh, as he notes? Or am I driven by my desire to please God? To walk like Jesus from 1 John chapter 2, verse 6. So where's that place for you? As you think in terms of how does 1 John chapter 2 speak to your very heart this morning? Where are the places in your life where you need to make some painful and perhaps difficult choices? So in Matthew chapter 7, the gate is described as narrow because in any given situation, full of many possibilities, believers are called to choose God's will and God's will alone. Now, I fully realize sometimes reaching a determination as to what is God's will in this matter, sometimes that's complex and necessitates a lot of prayer and a lot of biblical thought and lots of reflection and perhaps even conversation with wise people. I fully appreciate that. But in so many other ways, God's will is very clear. So as you face all these possibilities in your life, what is speaking to you from the passage in 1 John chapter 2 as your desire is to do the will of God and his will exclusively? The wide road, the spiritual road of death. One author shares these thoughts, and it is so well stated, I want to share it with you this morning. Here's what he says. The way that is broad is the easy, attractive, inclusive, indulgent, permissive, and self-oriented way of the world. There are few rules, few restrictions, and few requirements. All you need to do is profess Jesus, or at least be religious, and you're readily accepted into that large and diverse group. Sin is tolerated, truth is moderated, and humility ignored. God's word is praised but not studied, and his standards are admired but not followed. This way requires no spiritual maturity, no moral character, no commitment, and no sacrifice. What an appropriate analysis, if you will, of the passage in 1 John chapter 2. I want us to read it one final time together this morning. And as I read it this final time, perhaps the question that each of us should pose to ourselves. When you go out those doors in the south end of this building, and you prepare to begin a new week, how is this very passage speaking to your life, shaping your priorities, changing your heart? How is it convicting to you this morning? As our objective is to walk like Jesus did. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away. but whoever does the will of God lives forever. Cody's going to lead us in an invitation song. And it's always our heart to eagerly receive you wherever you find yourself at this very moment in life. Paul Lee is going to join me down here. Paul's one of our shepherds. And Paul is such a warm and kind person who would most definitely receive you and embrace you wherever you find yourself today. Additionally, in what we've now referred to as the corner room, we had a discussion before worship this morning. It's not the upper room, but it's the corner room, okay? So the corner room is to my right where there's a light on at the very back of this room. We have some additional shepherds who'll be back there. It's a little more of a private setting where you can share your very heart and ask these shepherds to pray over you, to listen, to have a few moments of mutual encouragement. So let's capitalize on such wonderful opportunities. Let's stand and sing our invitation song this morning.